Let's go.
Go back.
Hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Dan Maloney.
This is episode 246. Bypassing fingerprint readers is easy, killing memory chips is hard, and cell phones versus sperm. This week in the news, we have a cannibal CME, coronal mass ejection, coming our way.
No idea what that means, but it doesn't sound good.
I don't either.
I'm sure it's just some sort of space weather clickbaity sort of thing. But yeah, so I mean, the sun is very active compared to what you would normally expect at this point in the solar cycle. The news seems to be pretty constant with, hey, there's a group of sunspots that's really going to be active, or it takes a while for the material to get here. The electromagnetic radiation obviously gets here in about 8 minutes, but the matter itself, takes a while. So this actual flare was on the 28th. There was one previously on the 27th, and I think that's why they call it a cannibal one, because it was sort of one coronal ejection kind of ate the other. I think that's what the cannibal thing is. But anyways, it'll be here in a couple of days, sometime probably by the time this airs, I would think. Yeah, they're talking about December 1st, November 30th, December 1st. So,
all right.
The world, you may not even be listening to this at the time. The world may have ended by this
You
point.
can't even hear us. There's so much solar storm going on.
Yeah, we're all back in the Stone Age now, and we're chipping tools out of rocks instead of whatever this is.
What does that mean? I guess that means if we're lucky, we get to see auroras. Are you high up enough? You're high north up enough. I guess I am too, maybe.
I'm more than 45 degrees. I think I'm at 46 or 47 degrees. So it's pretty common here to see aurora if you can manage to stay up at night, which I generally can't.
Oh, for real? Have you seen them?
Oh yeah. Oh, definitely. I've seen them. Yeah. I wrote a whole story on that.
Yeah, but you have to understand, for me, it's like you've seen Bigfoot, because I've never seen an aurora with my own
I know.
eyes,
It was, and the thing is, sometimes you see the faint curtains and all that stuff, and you can kind of see a glow in the sky, and you're like, oh, wow, I just saw the northern lights. That's great. But the time I saw them was during that massive coronal mass ejection in 89, I think it was, 1989, the one that knocked all the power out in Quebec. And it was just unbelievable. It was the entire sky from horizon to horizon was just filled with orange, pink light. And I could actually hear like static, this static discharge in coming from the sky above us. It was That's fantastic. Awesome. It was real end of the world stuff. It didn't. So newsflash.
What does it mean for other people? Well, ionizes the heck out of the ionosphere, makes long-distance radio communication easier because it bounces better.
Makes the hams happy, yep.
Let's see. So radio stuff. What else?
Man, you can knock out GPS, although, that seems to be happening a lot in certain areas of the world,
that happens anyway.
Independent of aurora. A good CME can really expand the ionosphere, those upper reaches anyways of the atmosphere, and put more drag on satellites, so there could be more boost ups that have to happen. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes on.
Yeah, we'll have to see if it does end up being a really big one. We'll have to see if we can whip together some coverage for Monday or something.
That's a good idea.
If it ends up being not super interesting, well, you heard about it here first. The not super interesting solar flare.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
And with that lovely segue, let's head off to What's That Sound? This one is a blast from the computing past.
Okay, hopefully my special old ears will get it. Let's see. Okay. Seems to be a couple of things going on there, but I hear like a really high-speed platter spinning, so I'm thinking it's a hard drive or something.
Yeah, there's an old computer in the background. There's the other stuff going on, and I did make a little bit of a collage out of it.
I mean, the primary sound that I hear is the high-speed platter spinning. So I'm going to say it's an old hard drive of some sort.
It's an old computer doing something. Yeah, so this one's hard because it is an old computer doing something, but what's that sound effect over the top is what I'm looking for. But I'll take your answer. I'm happy to hear.
Not getting the details. Not getting the
No,
details.
I mean, you're not wrong. There's definitely an old hard drive in there. So if you listeners out there have an idea what this is, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. Fill in the form, give us your handle, your best guess, and a lucky winner will be selected from the correct answers next week, and we'll get you a Hackaday Podcast t-shirt. Well, my first hack this week is a hacky hack. Easily bypass laptop fingerprint sensors and Windows Hello. This is a piece of kind of white hat hacking on behalf of Microsoft, actually, to figure out how Windows Hello is working by Jesse Daguano and Timo Terras. It's a really cool talk because I didn't know how those fingerprint sensors work. And it turns out there's a whole bit of kind of software infrastructure and some really neat hardware to make them work and actually make them fairly secure. Although the punchline here, of course, is that they test 3 different computers and managed to break all 3 of them, each one a different way, which I thought was kind of cool. They're not doing anything with fake fingerprints here, and the sensors they're talking about do what they call match on chip, which means the fingerprint never leaves the chip. The little fingerprint sensor device talks directly to the operating system using the Secure Device Connection Protocol, SDCP. And this is to prevent, the kind of obvious ways you would attack the system if you had your hands on the device, which is maybe like to man in the middle it, or if you could read a good fingerprint read and then you could just replay that. The SDCP should prevent you from doing that. And it's got, kind of handshakes and challenge response system. The physical chips have to be signed with a public key that only Microsoft has the private key for, and there's a device certification process. They go through the security layers here in the beginning, and it actually sounds like a really hard nut to crack, but then they do it anyway. The first one they look at, the Windows SDCP implementation, is actually rock solid, and they decide that they can't get it to false, except the chip also has a backup mode to support Linux computers. And their logic is, if we can get it to go into Linux mode, maybe we can enroll a fingerprint on the Linux side and then get the Windows one to use the Linux mode and read that fingerprint out of it. And indeed, that's what they do. It ends up just being some USB hacking to change the one bit that the CPU sends to the device to tell it it's in Linux mode or Windows mode, and then it's looking up the keys in the wrong database, and boom, they're in. I thought that was really sweet. The other modules are much less well implemented. One of them has kind of a better security setup on one sense, in that it does this whole like TLS-esque handshaking. But unfortunately, it uses the BIOS ID number as the private key for the thing. And so... And they even mentioned that it's actually printed, the BIOS ID number is actually printed on the computer itself. And so the attack on this one ends up being entirely trivial because of bad implementation. And the third one's even worse. And this was actually on a Microsoft Surface. The operating system queries the chip, and apparently their security method is that it says, what's your ID number? The chip says its ID number, and then the OS says, oh yeah, okay, well, how many fingerprints do you have enrolled? And the device tells it that. I guess the idea there is that if it had 7 fingerprints enrolled and no fingerprint enrollment events have taken place, and now it has 8, that somebody's tampered with the chip or something. But it's unfortunately ridiculously trivial to read the response from this, where the number is 1 or 7. Or indeed, you could probably even brute force it, given the number is going to be like between 1 and 5. So they do this one live. They actually do all of their breaks live in this talk that we've linked to. This one they do super trivially by just like plugging a USB device in there, and it goes ba-ding. Of course, the first step is they have to unplug the keyboard because there's a clash between the 2 USB devices if they have the original keyboard in there. So they have to unplug it first and then plug a USB stick in. High tech. The kind of takeaway from this is that this seems to be a very well thought out system. Like the secure device connection protocol, and when they cover it, it seems really rock solid. And, all the secrets are stored in the silicon and you can't get them out. And the communication between the CPU and the device should be encrypted and all of this. And it's just the implementations are all lousy. And so they're able to get in between these things just because the people building the chips and or certifying them weren't on the same page as the Microsoft engineers who were doing the security design. And that's your way in. But I thought it was cool because the devices themselves look really good on paper. It's just the implementations are all kind of between bad and horrible.
Do people really use fingerprint authentication? I mean, that's like the first on my phone, on my laptop, anything. No, that's not. I'm not doing that. I want to have the something you have, something
Yeah.
that whole thing, and you can't search my brain. I mean, you could try. But you ain't gonna find anything. But seriously, like if law enforcement wants to unlock my phone, okay, go ahead, do it. I'm not going to help you. If you want to brute force, 10,000 possible passwords, go for it, or whatever tools you have. I'm sure there's backdoors that we don't know about, but at least I'm not providing it. I feel like it's the same thing with fingerprints. You're just asking for trouble. A court could compel you to put your finger on something, and
here, touch this.
At the end of the day, it's just a finger. You could have it removed, I mean,
That's right.
It's a lot harder to get a 4-digit password out of someone's head than it is to get someone's finger off their hand. If you really wanted to go to those extremes.
1-digit password.
That said, all of this is very interesting to see exactly how well thought out something can be. And it really only takes one little detail in the implementation to screw up the whole thing.
Yeah, well, whatever happens, it's extremely hard to change your password when your password is your fingerprints. And so, I find it a little ironic because there's all those people who are like, change your password every year. And then they're like, oh, yeah, and you can use your fingerprint for this. And I hope they're not the same set of people, because those two there should be no intersection in this Venn diagram, right? People who tell you to change your password often for security's sake, and then people who tell you to use your fingerprint.
I'll push back on that change your fingerprint just a little. Since I have a very vivid memory of being about 10 years old and having having a run-in with my soldering iron, reaching over without looking and putting my finger or my thumb on the tip of the soldering iron by mistake, and I'm like, why do I smell chicken? And I look over, oh my God. And there was this huge scar, and it's been there ever since. So your fingerprints do change.
It persists.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome.
It was a deep deep burn. It went past
the
into the second layer of the skin, so where the fingerprint actually is. So yeah, it's been different ever since.
Oh, dude, sorry.
Of course, I was only like 10 years old, so I didn't have much of a criminal record at that point. But
useless. It was a pointless action. Why did you?
It was. I should have waited. And you could. I mean, I suppose if you were really determined, you could make similar changes to your fingerprints with other forces. But yeah,
none for me, thanks.
No thanks.
Yeah.
First up for me is Harvard SETI project helps ID mystery sound. And I spotted this article coming in, and I was like, ooh, I want to check that out. And I opened it up, and I looked at the author of the article, and it was Avi Loeb. And I was like, boy, I don't know if I want to get into this, because if you're not familiar with the name, he's the guy, he's an astronomer at Harvard, and he's the guy who is making somewhat provocative statements about extraterrestrial technological explanations for things that people think are probably more easily explained, certainly are more easily explained as natural phenomenon, like Oumuamua, the interstellar comet fragment or asteroid or whatever it was that came through the solar system a couple of years. Oh, and he says, yeah, well, it could have been a spaceship. I'm like, well, yeah, it could have been. It could have been a lot of things. There's maybe more commonplace explanations. He did the same thing with an interstellar meteorite that entered the atmosphere over, I think, the Indian Ocean. And he went and did this gigantic project to recover fragments of that, which in and of itself is really amazing
Really
that he
cool.
was able to go and get bits of metal from the bottom of the ocean and be able to recover those technically was an amazing challenge. He says, based on analysis of the metals in the fragment and all that, that it could very well have been some sort of alien technology. Others say, yeah, it's just clinker from steam vessels that went through and discharged their waste into the ocean. So anyways, he has a history of making these somewhat controversial explanations for astronomical phenomenon. So when I saw this, I was like, nah, I don't want to get into it. But I'm glad Tom picked this up. Tom Nardi picked this up because it's really interesting. The start of this whole thing was, I think, earlier in the year over New Hampshire, there was a big explosion in the sky of some sort. And it was enough to shake windows and everybody, getting on social media saying, what was that? What was that? I mean, there's plenty of explanations for loud booms that come from the sky. You see a thunderstorm, loud booms come from the sky then. Supersonic aircraft go overhead, you get a sonic boom. There are sky quakes that just happen. There's cryoseisms, so basically frost earthquakes. Genuine earthquake, tectonic plate movement can cause sounds in that seem to come from the sky when they're actually coming from the ground. I mean, there's tons and tons of things. And I thought, well, here, he's just going to go with the aliens right off the bat. To his credit, he did not do that. Spoiler alert, this was probably a meteorite coming in off of the Orionid meteor shower and exploding in the atmosphere and making the sound. But the reason he was able to do that is because he is running a Galileo project, which is designed to basically search for technological signatures of extraterrestrial civilizations in our atmosphere. It's an array of sensors for visible light, I believe for radio waves, and also for sound signatures, everywhere from the infrasonic, way low sounds to the ultrasonic. And he's got this string of sensors that's basically listening to the sky, which I think in and of itself is really interesting and probably worth following up on for a story, because that's some cool stuff right there. And I'm glad someone's listening to the sky because, there's stuff to be learned. As is the case here, he was able to take the recording of this 12-second long mystery sound and do an analysis on it. Looks like literally back of the envelope analysis, by the way. It includes kind of a piece of paper where he just scribbled some formulas on. This shows you what the real value of a physicist is. And I think you could probably say the same thing about most engineers and a lot of scientists in general. When someone can just say, oh yeah, okay, well, this 12-second long sound that was about 40 kilometers away from the observation point and it lasted this long and blah, 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 put all these numbers together. And oh yeah, if we run it through the Taylor von Neumann Sedov's solution, which I guess is a formula that was come up with in the kind of Manhattan Project era to estimate yield of explosions based on the blast waves that they produce. Plugged all that into a formula and came up with approximately 10 to the 20th ergs of energy, or roughly 2.5 kilotons of TNT at a distance of about 40 kilometers from the point of observation, which pretty much points to, it was probably an Orionid meteor coming in at about like 66 kilometers per second. So it was a space rock. I mean, that's kind of boring in a way, but the way he got to space rock is really interesting. And the fact that he didn't say aliens or alien ship or, whatever, and said, nah, it was a space rock, I think is, to his credit, it's definitely an interesting process that it took him to get to this point.
I think the Amos project, and that's that sound recording one, acoustic monitoring omnidirectional system, kind of a contrived.
A little bit.
Usual science style contrived acronym. But I think that's an awesome project. And just the idea of recording, kind of broadband sound and seeing what you can hear is kind of, whether it's going to pick up, natural sounds or human-made sounds or whatever, I think is a really neat project. And, in comparison to some of the other, deep space telescopes and stuff, it's actually probably pretty cheap to implement something like
exactly.
this.
Yeah.
What their highest frequency is, 100 kilohertz or something. It's not that fast, 200 something kilohertz. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not that much data. With a couple different microphones, you could get this done very cheaply. And then once you start getting computer algorithms trained to look for stuff, you could really learn something from it. I think it's an awesome and kind of, just an interesting modality for collecting data. And I hope there's all sorts of crazy science to come out of this.
I'm sure this is like old school. Yeah, we've been doing that for decades for the government. They've been listening, the U.S. government and the Soviet government and probably governments all over the world are listening to everybody else listening on the air, like radio waves, and listening in the air, sound waves, to see what other people are doing. So this is old news to them, but, and they do that underwater too. This is kind of similar to the SOSUS net that runs under the Atlantic, under the North Atlantic, listening for Soviet subs coming out of the North Sea. That itself fascinates me, and that's something you can't get too much information on, obviously, on how it works and where the stations are and how they're wired together and all that stuff. I'd like to poke at that a little bit, but I don't want to end up in jail. This one seems like a probably more approachable sort of project. What is this? Is this what kind of microphones are you using? How are you amplifying the sound? How are you analyzing it? How are you doing these acoustograms?
It'd be super cool to do this as a citizen science project too, and just, make a distributed listening station that a whole bunch of people could deploy outside their houses and see what you get when you aggregate all this data up too. Oh, I think there's all sorts of cool things to learn here. There must be all sorts of ecology you could do with a big network of these. Oh, dude, I don't even want to get into it. Oh, also reminds me of the various fireball detection networks. One of those must have had this on there too. Like somebody must have had this on film to map.
Like watching, the ones that actually watch for those.
I bet it's easy to verify that way too. So that'd be fun. My next hack comes from actually Hackaday alum Limpkin, a 48-volt battery pack with carefully balanced cells. This is the story of what you do when you find 100 18650 cells for cheap on eBay and you buy them all. The answer is you have to make a pretty cool battery pack out of them. And in this case, he's only using, it's 13S6P. Quickly, what's 13 times 6?
78? I see 78 in the text, so I'm not that good at math.
Damn it. I was like, that's pretty fast, dude. Yeah, 78 it is. He's cherry picking the 78 best cells out of this and putting them into actually a bought from China 48-volt battery kit. And this is all kind of neat because, I play around with used 18650 cells. Whenever I find them, I kind of scrounge them up, I test them out, see if they run, and if they do, I put them in a project. And that's kind of the end of it, right? Not 78 of them in a project, and absolutely requires a certain amount of care. And he took it here, I think. I mean, again, you're on your own when it comes to exploding batteries in your own basements. But the part we wrote up here in this article was the battery balancing stage. So he got these and they all have disparate state of charge on them. And so he made this crazy printed circuit board with a bunch of resistors between each cell. And he just plugs them all in there and lets the resistance even them all out. And so they all come to kind of around the same voltage level. It's kind of the world's most gigantic balancing battery charger you've ever seen. It's really fun to look at. And then he picks them out. He kind of sorts them by equivalent series resistance and then puts them into parallels and then puts the parallels in series and makes his battery pack out of them, like you do. Like I try to balance batteries before I put them together in a pack too, but I'm doing like 5 of them or 6 of them or 2 of them. And not 78 or most of the way to 100 of them. And so that's a different scale problem. So I do have to say I appreciate the solution here. It's also kind of neat to see what you can just order in terms of, the frame and the battery tabs and the, an indicator and a balance charger and all of this as a straight up kit. I didn't know that was you buy all the parts, supply your own used 18650 cells, and you can build a fairly snazzy looking, battery pack for an e-bike or something like that. I think it's a 48 volt pack he ends up building in the end here. The whole topic of how to handle a bunch of 18650s is a neat one. And I've been building some battery packs, and I thought this was a pretty useful take on it all. I know you've been building some battery packs
I
too,
have,
though.
yeah. I have a box of the old modem battery packs. I think they've each got two 18650s in them. Every once in a while, I pull that out and break open a modem, get rid of the BMS or whatever it is. I don't know if it's a BMS, but break them out and break them apart and just sort of stash them away for something. I never quite get the something, but I've got a hell of a lot of batteries, and something like this helps me think, makes me think that I could probably put them to use. I'm fascinated by this PC board. It's what, the size of 2 sheets of paper, maybe? It's enormous.
Yeah.
It's got to be really expensive to get something like that fabricated, but I don't see anywhere where he talks about that. It's a PCB weight. They graciously offer to produce it for him. So how not? Yeah, that's nice. Actually,
You got it for free.
Gotta be nice. I love the silk screening on it with the gigantic plus at the top and minus at the bottom, and the caution 100 amps when shorted warning on it. It kind of is a bomb if you mishandle it, and then a lot of people in the comments were kind of going off on that. Yeah, why would you build a battery pack when you can buy it? And there's a great comment, because this is not purchase a day, it's hack a day.
This also isn't the battery pack. This is the pre-battery pack.
And this isn't the battery pack. This is, I guess he's just sort of passive balancing them, right? He's just letting them all figure it out themselves over time, which I actually did on my lithium battery packs. They just sat there for months and sort of evened out while I was waiting to sort of put the whole system together. I did graduate past those and went with commercial batteries now, because I felt like it was enough of a mission critical sort of application that I didn't really want to use a homemade battery pack. It's a little scary when you're playing with batteries. I mean, there's no room for error. You can't turn them off, right? I mean, it's just is what it is. It's always alive. And if you make a wrong move, you can have a exciting day, and not necessarily in a good way.
We were doing some hoverboard hacking, and we needed a new battery for it because the hoverboard I bought was dirt cheap, but the battery pack was predictably completely ruined, and it ended up having like 3 bad cells in it when I clipped it all apart. But I had 20 cells on hand that were basically about right, so I tack welded them all together, and boom, battery pack. I mean, it's totally useful to have these things around and to be able to assemble them into packs. And yeah, this stuff is not rocket science. It's something you definitely can do yourself. Everybody in the comments on this one, and anytime we mention lithium battery chemistry, it's always like, these things are little bombs. Yeah, I guess it's true. 18650s are pretty damn robust, at least compared to the lithium polymer pouch batteries in my experience. But yeah, they can all be abused and put together wrong. And if you want to read a good guide to building up a battery pack out of a bunch of individual batteries, Lou and Day wrote up a piece in 2020, A Beginner's Guide to Lithium Rechargeable Batteries. You should absolutely have a look at that. It covers the safety aspects, and it covers the kind of balanced charging aspects, etc., etc. Just as my personal rant, if you remember back when the hoverboards were brand new, there were a bunch of horrible battery failures, and they were due to 1 or 2 cells going bad and the chargers on board not loading up each of the cells individually, but trying to charge them all in bulk, which then overtaxes the already weak batteries until they totally fail. But if you're careful and you do some good balance charging, you can even use kind of random batteries together as long as you rebalance them out every once in a while, and totally get away with it. Or at least that's my experience. And I haven't had anything catch on fire yet. So yeah, you could sell insurance based on that track record.
One criticism you could have on this is he makes this enormous PCB, and it's really a one-time use case. It doesn't do anything other than balance these batteries. On the other hand, it seems like a really good basis for a spot welder for welding the batteries together, right? I mean, you got a lot of current there, 100 amps,
100. Oh, I don't even know. I mean, 100 batteries in parallel is.
It might be a little too much.
Yikes.
But, I'm saying it's a basis. I'm not saying initially you're going to use it.
Yeah.
Just attach something to the plus and the minus and go nuts. Might be a little too much. But then again, it could be used as like a car jump starter or a whole bunch of other things. If you reconfigure it to the right voltages, you could probably put this thing back to work too. I don't think it's necessarily a one-off that's going to just get thrown in a drawer someplace and you'll never see it again.
And assuming he's got an electric vehicle of some kind to power, he may be making a bunch of these cells and balancing out, more than one lot of 100 batteries. So who knows? I'm a little bit jealous, honestly.
Next up for me, an automated watch cleaner from an older 3D printer. This one is by Dave Burkus, and I like it because, we're getting to the point in 3D printers where you've got maybe one lying around. You've got the one that you started with, and then you bought the, fancy new Bamboo or something like that, and then your old Creality is just sort of sitting there. And, rather than being idle, there's a lot of things you can do with a general purpose XYZ gantry that has a decent work volume. In the case of Dave Burkus, it was to turn it into a wristwatch cleaner. Now, if you don't know what a wristwatch cleaner is, it's pretty self-descriptive. It's a little bit deeper than that. This is a tool made for people who repair mechanical watches as a hobby, as a business. Suppose as a business, you would buy one of these commercially, but you're talking $3,000-$4,000 for something like that. This is a whole lot cheaper, and basically what it does is the commercial versions of these basically have a number of workstations, maybe 3, maybe 4. Each station has a container that will hold some sort of solvent, something to cut oils and greases that accumulate inside of a mechanical watch. So some sort of solvent, some sort of rinse, something with maybe a surfactant on it, a bunch of different solutions to do different things. And you have a basket that the parts go in that can contain these incredibly tiny parts often, so that they don't get loose and they don't get damaged. But the basket then goes into the solution and can swish around back and forth, back and forth. It's a gentle sort of wash, but it's still very vigorous for the size of the parts and the degree of contamination that they have. And it's specialized for getting rid of accumulated greases and dirts and the amazing number of skin cells that make their way into a wristwatch, which is kind of gross, but as a fact of life, that's you wear it on your body, you're going to get skin cells and hair and stuff like that in it. So the commercial versions of these, like I said, are very expensive, but if you've got a 3D printer, you've got this work area, the build plate, and that heats too, which is nice because you do probably want to heat your solvents. You've got XY positioning, and you've got a Z axis that you can take this basket and move it from one to another of these containers. So you've got all the parts you need. Now all you need to do is basically take the extruder off, which is what Dave did here, and replace it with a motor and a shaft that can hold this basket for the parts. That was purchased commercially, but you could just as easily have 3D printed that if you wanted to, or made it out of aluminum or something like that. But just for expediency, he purchased the cleaning baskets. And I had to do a little bit of fiddling around with the firmware to convince it to do what he wanted to do as far as rotating the basket and activating the heat, which didn't, from what I understand, the heat part of it didn't work as well as he expected. But you can still kind of work on that with the firmware, or you could just have a separate heating element that sits on the bed and does the same thing. In the comments, there was some, concern that there's no ultrasonic cleaning in this, and that's not a difficult problem to solve. You could easily add ultrasonic transducers to each of these vessels or one of them, then have that specialized for an ultrasonic clean, and then it goes into a rinse and the solvents, or there's a whole bunch of different escalations of this that you go through and to get to a specific cleaning solution that works for you. If you really want to see one of these in action, I mean, obviously you can take a look at this article and click through to the original. There's a guy on YouTube, Wristwatch Revival, the greatest ASMR sort of fall to sleep watching this videos of watch repair on everything from, old Rolexes to, treasured wristwatch, this teeny tiny because it's a, very small scale woman's watch, old watches from veterans who use them in combat, these remarkable pieces of machinery that were the original wearables, the original wearable technology anyways. He opens them up and cleans them out. And by the end of watching your first video, you're like, ooh, I know what a pallet fork is. And ooh, that mainspring, it seems like it's got a problem. And you kind of get into this. He kind of sucks you along with this journey into the innards of watches. And it's really fascinating stuff. And he uses one of these, he uses a commercial watch cleaner, but very similar, at least in function, to what Dave has come up with here.
I love the ubiquity of old 3D printers as like XYZ stage and just, using them for crazy random hacks that you didn't think of. And this one, spinning watch parts in a bunch of different solvents is totally one of them. And I like that a lot, a lot, a lot. The missing part, of course, is doing the motor control stuff. And here he's using Clipper, but you could probably program some G code to do this. And honestly, you're a camera for feedback away from making a kind of rudimentary pick and place machine or whatever out of this. It was mostly just the gag, but I used my 3D printer as a heater and agitator for doing PCB etching. So I just put the board in a Tupperware, put it on there, and I wrote code that said, go to Y200, go to Y negative 200, go to Y200, go to Y negative 200. And it just went back and forth sloshing the thing. It worked totally well, Yeah, it's really fun to just think of all the dumb uses you could put a spare 3D printer to if you didn't need it for 3D printing. They make great plotters.
Exactly. Actually, sort of reminds me of my lab automation days when I used to have a real job. And I mean, we used these XY liquid handlers made by a company called Hamilton, and they were much bigger than a 3D printer. These were probably a meter wide, maybe half a meter deep. So you had this entire, gigantic work area to go in, and that would be, in the original intent, there'd be test tubes or microtiter plates or vessels of some sort, and then XY positioner or gantry would position a probe above the vessel and stick that down, and a syringe pump would suck up some whatever solution and move it over to another vessel. And that was the intended use of those, but we used to put those to work in all kinds of things as general XYZ gantry systems that had a big work volume. You'd love to have a 3D printer that had that much workspace, although I guess it would actually cause some problems with some prints. But we used to repurpose those things all the time. Just take them out of the crate and put them on a system, and instead of being a liquid handler, it would be a positioner of some sort. We'd use them for cell culture. We'd use them for a whole bunch of different uses. Looking at the setup of the watch cleaner, there's very little difference between where it is right now and something that could be used for biohacking, like cell culture, splitting cell lines, a whole bunch of different stuff you could do with almost exactly this setup, very little modification. So yeah, the fact that there's these cheap and relatively precise and readily available CNC controlled platforms that are generically useful is kind of exciting, that a lot of them are just sitting around in closets or on shelves collecting dust, and they can be put to work doing whatever. I really like that.
Oh my God, best segue ever. I didn't even realize I did this. My next hack, G-code goes binary with proposed new format.
Nice.
Talks about exactly what we would have needed to do to make these old 3D printers run custom routines for us, which is hand code up some G code ourselves. And actually, because I like to hand code G code myself, I looked at this announcement of a potential binary G code format coming from Prusa with kind of my critical eye, because I like having G code be understandable. I like being able to say, go here and make a circle this big, and then, go a little bit deeper and mill it out again, go a little bit deeper and mill it out again, and then you got a circle. I mean, everybody likes circles. Why would you ever want to have a binary G code format? And so I had to look deep into it. I have to say, I'm still not entirely convinced, but the point is, when your 3D printer gets to the point that the command sender can't push enough G code out to it fast enough over whatever baud serial port you've got, then you have a problem. And one of the things that this .bg code binary G code format does, it includes an optional compression algorithm. So if you want to shrink your G code down to about half its size, that kind of doubles your baud rate effectively. And so if you're running into the baud rate bottleneck, using the meat pack option is a good one. If you look at the specs for this, the other things it does is kind of like a wrapper around the G code, and it has a bunch of different blocks. All of them have different metadata and different specs for them. It offers you a bunch more flexibility in what you can kind of embed into the G code file. I think we can argue about whether it belongs in there after all, but I think if you look at this as a wrapper around G code, then I think you're looking at it the right way. It has a file header, it has version numbers, it has the option to include thumbnail images in it. You can say this part of the G code does this object or does this set of features. This part of the code does these. So you can kind of label the different blocks in there, which makes it, a lot more easily hackable in a way if you know which segment of the file you need to get at. There's some weird things in here that I'm not sure I'll ever use. Like, honestly, thumbnail images, meh. I mean, there's all sorts of print metadata. So if you are trying to customize this, and I think this is kind of Prusa's main thrust, but I don't 100% know. They might actually be really interested in thumbnail preview images. But they also have like other metadata. So like you can say, this is extruding this much filament, or this temperature is for working with this filament I've got, right? And you can add all these kind of notes to yourself for later so that the G code better reflects like all of the conditions when you printed it out. They've also got some kind of weird slicer metadata and then some kind of proprietary write your secret stuff here. Things that are obviously good include kind of checksums on all the different blocks, so you can at least tell if they are coming across uncontaminated. So that's probably useful if you have like a noisy serial connection. And kind of at the end of the day, all of these different blocks are optional. The packing and unpacking is extraordinarily transparent and obvious. And, if you were given one of these G-code binary files and you wanted to just open it up, tweak around with the G-code yourself, and then put it back into a binary file format, that would be easy as all heck to do. Part of me will miss and does miss, I guess, the kind of raw accessibility of having G-code be essentially human readable, at least to the set of humans who know that G1 means, go from here to here at the specified feed rate. But like, it really is go from here to, X this coordinate, Y this coordinate, Z this coordinate. It is kind of human readable, human writable as it stands. And I don't like that this is a step away from that, but on the other hand, it's a really light wrapper around that. It's easy to go back and forth, and it's gonna allow you to put a whole bunch more details into the file that kind of describe what went on when you sliced it, when you print it, what filament it's designed for, and etc. So it's gonna make a lot of 3D printer users' life easier.
It sort of reminds me of the difference between PostScript and PDF.
Yeah.
We had a programmer in the department I worked in a long time ago who supported, different data efforts in the department and all that. And he had an entire suite of software that he wrote completely in PostScript. He was always keen to tell you, oh, and this is great because I can go in there and I can maintain it. I can make these changes. I can, if you want to change something, it's real easy because it's just, straight text format, blah, 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 and I thought that was pretty cool at the time. And then PDF came along some time after that as a format that kind of entered my consciousness. And I'm like, how does that affect what he used to do? I wonder if he had to like port everything to support PDF from PostScript, because I believe PDF is kind of a wrapper around PostScript in a similar way as this, except I don't think it's as lightweight a wrapper as this is.
I always look at the G code before I run it because like there's just a bunch of things you can see. Did I remember to do this? Did I remember to do that before you hit go and send the job to the woodcutting monster? And so like I always spot check whether whether it's centered on 0, whether it spins the motor up before it goes. There's a whole bunch of stupid mistakes you can make when running a CNC machine that you can see if you can just kind of quickly skim through. And that would be missing here, I guess. So I think, I wouldn't do it for that application. On the other hand, I don't think I've ever really run into the baud rate bottleneck on sending G code either. So, maybe with the really high-speed 3D printers out there, that actually is more of a deal. And the people who use the various compression plugins, and this one supports one called Meatpack. You can check it out. I'll throw links in the show notes. It really is a very simple encoding, decoding scheme. It's one-to-one. It's fast enough it can run on an AVR microcontroller. So if you've got some underpowered microcontroller doing your G-code interpretation conversion, it actually isn't a problem to include this encoding, decoding layer on it. It's super lightweight and it's one-to-one. And so in that sense, I do understand it. But on the other hand, I just like being able to eyeball if I made a mistake before I press the big green button.
Okay, last for me, fail of the week. This flash drive will not self-destruct in 5 seconds. Elliot, we got to get some Lalo Schifrin in here. If we get a copyright strike, I'm sorry, but we got to get a little of that Mission Impossible music here, because this is the first thing I thought of when I saw this. Exactly. The first thing I thought of was this tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds, classic from the 1960s Mission Impossible. I don't know if they did that in the movies or not, but whatever. But basically what Walker is trying to do here with his Overdrive project is a little bit like that, but on a more serious note, because his imagined use case for a USB thumb drive, flash drive that could self-destruct is a serious business. There are some people who, whistleblowers, journalists, probably black hat hackers too, who don't want to get caught with some of the stuff that they're producing digitally, and would potentially benefit tremendously from having a thumb drive that you could surreptitiously cause to be, as I put it in the article, rapidly forensically unavailable. Because we all know that, simply erasing a hard drive or erasing a flash drive means nothing. You give it to the NSA or the FBI or MI6 or whoever, and they've probably got a way to open that thing up and look at it, with an electron microscope or something like that, and figure out what the data is on there and use that against you. So his idea originally was to damage the chip on the flash drive electrically with a voltage doubler and apply enough voltage to exceed the absolute maximums on a per pin basis for the chip and cause it to be snuffed, basically. And you're gonna kill this chip. He did a little prototyping on that, and that actually worked. He was able to corrupt some of the files on the flash chip, so that was enough for him to proceed to the second stage, which was a prototype that actually managed to release some smoke when he did this. But that ended up being kind of a one-off. He couldn't repeat that. The puff of smoke thing ended up being kind of a fluke. Couldn't repeat that, at least not with the reliability that you're looking for if someone's got a gun to your head, which, very well might be the case for his imagined, sort of scenarios. So he kind of stepped up the game a little bit, thinking that maybe reversing the polarity on the chip would be a more effective way of destroying it. It seemed like it was going to be pretty good because a thermal camera showed that reversing the polarity with an H bridge jacked the surface temperature of the chip up to like 167 C, which is no fooling. That's pretty hot. But it didn't seem to do anything to the data. It was all still there. He really tried everything. And I mentioned in the article that I wrote here that the look of defeat on his face when he's talking about this in the video is very clear. He's been working on this for months and can't kill a flash chip. Seems like it would be pretty easy to do. And of course, the comment section is full of interesting suggestions. Being destructive or giving the opportunity to be destructive, people will be extremely creative. There's all kinds of suggestions about, acids and thermite and nitinol wire wrapped around, to scorch it, arc generators, high voltage to, piezoelectric, all kinds of interesting things. A lot of that will work, but so will taking the drive out and throwing it in a microwave or putting it in a blender or, paper shredder or something like that. And that's kind of not the point. This is to appear as a normal thumb drive until the very moment that it needs to, be eliminated and a certain signal needs to be sent and it needs to happen without a whole lot of observable phenomenon. So you don't want something that's going to, all of a sudden, big sparks shooting out of it, or even the smoke that Dave got in that prototype. It probably wouldn't work to have someone kicking down the door and then you see, they get in and they see you, doing something that obviously is destroying data. You probably don't want to do that. You probably want to be a lot more stealthy about it. And I think that's what he's shooting for here. So I'm hoping that he continues on. The look of defeat was very, very palpable. Maybe he's done with this at this point. I don't know. He did mention he wants to maybe combine the overvoltage and the reverse polarity to give it one last shot. It just seems like the electronics is a lot more durable than we give it credit for. We think it's easy to kill, but Walker's having a hard time doing it.
I love that he can't get the memory chip to die. Like, that's beautiful. That's what I like to see, because I don't want my memory chips dying most of the time. It's kind of fun that way. Now, we've been following this project for a long time, and I'll throw a link to the first iteration of this in for you all. USB drive keeps your secrets as long as your fingers are wet. Because his mechanism, talk about his crazy covert activation mechanism, was originally that you would have to lick your fingers and press on a certain spot, making enough contact every time you used it. And if you didn't do that, like if someone who didn't know that was the secret plugged it into their drive, it would then destroy itself. And I thought that was really fun.
That's pretty clever. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved that as a mechanism. And I don't know if that aspect lived on into this one. He was originally implementing it with, I think, just like a simple comparator circuit or like an AND or something. Like, it was a beautiful logic solution to a very simple problem back in the day. Yeah, I'm bummed that it doesn't self-destruct. I think the most plausible answer out of the comments was someone suggested you do it in RAM and you have a battery. And so you have it, always refreshing the RAM until you fail to give it the secret signal. And then it just like lets it all go, or starts rewriting it as fast as it can with random numbers or something. Because if you think of it like a watchdog problem, instead of having something destructive happen, you want to have it be always keeping itself barely alive, always reviving itself until something fails to happen, and then it goes away, right? And so like that's where using RAM makes a ton of sense here. Maybe that's for the next one. As long as I get to see the wet finger secret handshake come back, I'm happy to have him switch over to RAM.
Well, I do like the trigger mechanism that the latest version has, which is rapidly putting it in and out of the USB port 3 times. I think that's pretty clever because especially like if you're a journalist who's all of a sudden up against the secret police of whatever country, you might be under a considerable amount of duress, and they're like plug that in, and you're like okay, and you're shaking, and you could kind of hide your trigger, whereas if you're like, okay, I'll plug it in, but I got to lick my fingers first, it might be a little bit of a high sign. The other thing that's interesting in the comments is everybody's, war stories about, well, back in the day, I plugged in a blah, blah, blah backwards. And, everybody's got sort of a story about how hard chips are to kill. One, one that I really liked is someone was testing a bunch of EPROMs, the kind with the clear window, the UV erasable ones.
Right.
So you can actually see the silicon in there. He plugged it in and managed to plug it in backwards so that VCC was ground and ground was VCC. He said, "Wow, that's an interesting. Intel apparently added a pilot light to the inside of the like. Oh no, that's actually the silicon die. That's that's lighting up at this point." And that didn't even kill it. It was perfectly fine. So, I mean, I guess that the lesson is silicon is tougher than you think it is, and killing it is a lot harder than it appears.
My first quick hack comes from Magnus Thorn. Capacitive rain meter measures the sky water just fine. This is a simple capacitive sensor that uses kind of the frequency of an alternating current circuit. When the water drops on there, it adds more capacitance, it lowers the frequency. But what I thought was cool about this was that it also includes a 2-watt heater to melt snow. And I guess I'd never thought about how you measure the water content of snow when it hits your precipitation meter. But of course the answer is you heat it up and melt it. Next up from Vintage Tech, Tektronix Ceramic CRT Production and the Building 13 Catacombs. This is a neat story about the crawl space below Building 13 at the Tektronix Center and the former home of the ceramics operation. They used to make CRT tubes with ceramic envelopes instead of glass so that they didn't break as easily, and they're all stored under the basement of one of these buildings over there. It's good fun to look at some vintage scope parts. Extreme 3D Print, single-piece tank chassis goes robotic. This is a for-pay 3D print file, but it's really cool. It has like 50 pieces and it's all print in place. And then you fold it up together and it becomes a working tank complete with print in place tank treads. Check it out. You might be inspired. And last up, Northwestern University in New Doctor's Office, Stethoscope Wears You is a really interesting idea to make essentially disposable sticky mount stethoscopes that you can stick on patients so that you can monitor them all the time. It's kind of like that AMOS system, but for people and the health application. So I do like the idea. Of course, you can't be monitoring these all the time with a person, but if you can write the computer algorithm that tells when the abnormal noises are being made, you can use this to alert the right medical personnel, right? The idea itself is very simple, but I think it could actually have serious impact.
Okay, my quick picks this week are starting off with come for the PCB holder, stay for the tour of FreeCAD. Everybody needs something to solder with. Holding things down and chasing them around with a soldering iron just doesn't work. So this is basically a simple vise for PCBs. Real simple, based on 2020 extrusion and a couple of 3D printed pieces. It's nothing complicated, but it's very nice. The interesting thing to me here is that you can actually get a good look into someone else's process of using FreeCAD. For me, learning by doing is really important, more learning by watching other people do, but it's still very handy to be able to get that sort of look into someone's process and see how they're using a tool versus how you would use a tool. It gives you some insights into your process. Next up, a tube guitar amp for a modest budget. This is a great one by Electro Idiot. Basically, this is kind of a junkyard kind of looking build. It's lovely in an ugly sort of way or ugly in a lovely sort of way. I don't know which way that would go. But basically, it's a tube amplifier, 2 tubes, 2 transformers, and a bunch of parts on the bottom. That's where the real gem of this is to me, the sort of cordwood construction down below decks of the hand-bent aluminum chassis with a bunch of knobs and dials on the front of it. That one of them looks like it goes to 11. And a simple toggle switch on the front too. It's janky and it's wonderful and it sounds great. And last up for me, bowling with strings attached. People are split. I mean, if you've ever been bowling, you know that the machine that does the pin setting in back is a complicated beast that has to conveyor belts and arms and lifts and motors and all kinds of things that make it work. but it works. This is a little bit different. They're using strings attached to the top of the pins that lift the pins once they're hit with the ball. They lift the pins into sort of a jig with holes drilled in it that sort of settles the pins down in their pendulum action. And then the strings all lower at once to put the pins back in their place. And the strings stay there. And I think that's what I hate about this, is that the strings are there. I know they've tested it, and the Bowling Congress says it's fine, but I hate it. I think those strings have to interfere with the action of the pins when the ball hits them, and I just think, I like the pin setting machine. I know I'd feel different if I were a bowling alley owner. They're expensive and expensive to maintain, but something about this one just doesn't sit right.
All right, well, that brings us to the Can't Miss articles. These are long-form pieces written by our fantastic Hackaday writing staff. Ooh, this week's a Lewin twofer.
Yeah.
I picked his, How Do You Prove an AI Didn't Make Your Art? And this was inspired by an artist Lewin knows, Mizkai, who had entered a kind of anime drawing into an art contest, got told it was done by an AI, and got it rejected. And that's just crazy to think that that's where we're at now. A few years ago, it would have been, no way do I believe that's AI generated art. And now it's no way do I believe that's human generated art. So what world are we in? What's funny is that even after she documented drawing it fairly extensively, like pen strokes and everything, they still rejected it. So I think there's some kind of alternative motives going on here. But it is an interesting question because, especially for copyright uses, you can't put copyright on AI generated art. If it was made purely by a machine, it is not eligible for copyright at all. And so this is going to be a real question in the future. And there's going to be serious litigation on this where people will have to prove that they made their artwork in order to hold the copyright on it. Lewin has a super ton of fun picking some great, I think mostly DALL-E generated images for this one. You should really check that out. He really hit it out of the park. There's a Jolly Wrencher that has the crossed wrenches beneath the skull, but then it's also got the vestigial wrenches above the skull, which is, the Jolly Wrencher equivalent of the six-fingered hand, right? And it's in a Blade Runner futuresque kind of landscape, which means lots and lots of Chinese. And if you can actually read Chinese, almost none of the characters are legit, which is of course what you also get out of AI. So it's the perfect AI image. It looks really good, it looks really slick, but then all of the details are wrong. Same with his 1980s computer magazine image, which says on it 19880S. It says it's supposed to say 1980s, but there's an extra 8 in it. Why? Because that's what AI does when it makes text. It throws in extra letters. So I think Lewin had a lot of fun with the art for this one, but I think the point is actually kind of serious, which is that in the future it's going to be interesting, useful, and difficult to prove the provenance of digital art. And how we're going to do that is anyone's guess. People suggest you could do what Mizkai did and document your work as you go along, but then of course everyone else in the comments is yeah, but then they'll just train an AI to do the individual steps for you too. How do you prove there's a human in it? I think unless you can hand someone the paint on the canvas, and say, look, this was painted by a hand and not a robot wielded by an AI. Oh crap, that won't work either. Nope, there's no way.
Nope,
there's no way to prove it.
There was a project that I wrote about not too long ago where someone built an e-ink kind of magic mirror almost thing, but using AI to generate images that are based on his calendar events for the day. So, if it's go to a mechanic to get something done to your car, that ends up being put into the prompt. And the images are fantastic. a lot of it has to do with his aesthetic sense and describing what he wants in these images. But they're fantastic images. You look at them and you're like, that's art. I mean, it didn't exist, and now it does, and it's wonderful, and it encapsulates a particular thing based on his calendar of events. A fantastic project. I'll put a link in for that. And this kind of reminds me of that. I mean, in some ways, do we care if our AI or if our art is AI generated? If it's just to illustrate something? I don't really care that he's using AI to do this. And, it just doesn't bother me in this case. But on the other hand, I see in a competition where you're, going up against other people, you really should be concerned whether someone did it or something did it. But then again, is it just another tool? Are you upset that, someone won a photography contest by using a camera, right? I mean,
right.
you needed that tool to make the photograph. And does that make it less art that he, that someone put it on paper, or, drew it by hand rather than photographed it? I don't know what I'm trying to say. I guess art happens in so many different ways that as long as everybody knows what's going on, I don't think it's as much of a problem as it could be. I think people are making it more of a problem than it could be in a lot of ways. To me, it's just another tool, and I don't want it used all the time. When it's put to use correctly, it really comes up with some really cool results.
Yeah, I think that's hitting on something there. I think both the kind of, what's the role of technology in art question is being reopened quite heavily right now. And I also think what's the purpose of art, right? And I mean, these pictures are meant to accompany a calendar. They're going to be one a day. They're entirely disposable. It would be a horrible waste of a person's talent to have them draw these pictures for you based on your calendar appointments every day, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is something that I can, I see Daddy Warbucks doing, hiring an artist to draw out his calendar every day. Right? Like, it's just wrong, especially since it's going to be thrown away. I think that's really neat that this application then becomes possible. And so in that sense, totally. In the end, you look through these pictures and you're like, they're pretty fun and they do exactly what they're supposed to do. But, is it art? It's definitely, I mean, it's a drawing. So I guess it's little a art, but it's definitely not capital A art. There's no deeper meaning in any of these pictures. But they're awesome little cartoons. And I do like that. I think as we kind of settle down into this AI art thing, it's going to become its own goofy art form to have cats with wings on their ears and such. I mean, the really crazy hallucinations are really fun. My guess is then in 2 or 3 more years, we're going to become so bored with them that it's not even going to be like, it's not going to be market viable anymore. Like right now, it's awesome to see, John Oliver as a cauliflower, but like that won't be awesome forever. Like, I think we're in some kind of weird transitional phase where it's dead on hilarious right now, but sooner or later we'll get over it.
Probably. Okay, my pick this week is Lewin Day's Mobile Phones and the Question of Declining Sperm Quality. Get your snickering out right now. Just get it done, and we'll get back to business here. This is a serious issue, obviously. Anything that has to do with public health is something that you got to take seriously. But it's also one of those things that raises eyebrows right away in the technological, oriented crowd who don't see any possible way that something as innocuous as, non-ionizing radiation could possibly have any effect on, bodily systems in general, but, in this case, especially sperm. And I think a lot of that has to do with our popular culture outlook of Hiroshima, Godzilla, mutations, radiation. You kind of go down this whole thing and, like, oh, no, well, I mean, if there's no ionizing radiation, then there can't be any changes to cells. There can't be any changes to DNA DNA. So, why are you even bothering with this? And then you put on the tinfoil hat. The specifics of this article are kind of important. There's some pretty good evidence that there's something going on between phones and the quality of sperm in the human population. And not just in the sperm counts in men, but also in the motility and morphological changes that might come along that don't look good when it comes to sperm being a possible candidate for actually, making it to an egg and fertilizing it. Which obviously, if you want more humans, you got to have, operating sperm. The article goes into quite a bit of detail about studies that have been, go back to at least 2014. Essentially, the experiment is take sperm samples, put them in a box with a cell phone, incubate them basically, and see what happens to the sperm. There's not a lot of detail about what this phone is doing at the time, whether it's, is it downloading a video? Is it playing some music? Is it just sitting there idle sort of thing? So I can't really make a judgment about what the power output of this phone is or what this phone is actually doing. But that's a good rough first experiment. What does a phone that's isolated from the environment with a sample of tissue do to that tissue? Rather, what happens to tissue when it's in this situation? And what happens to it is basically nothing good. They're basically seeing decreased, quote unquote, progressive movement, which I think basically means, movement with a purpose, movement toward a goal. So, sperm motility would probably be what you would characterize that as, but it also has to go in a direction. There's also an increase in DNA fragmentation. Now, whether that's associated with any pathology, that's not really the point of the experiment. It's just sort of a rough first pass at, is there an effect on sperm morphologically and functionally in an environment where a cell phone is present? And the answer is yes. Multiple experiments that kind of detail that here with different conditions and different levels of cell phone use. The first thing that comes to mind for me is we all live in an RF soup. We walk around in this all day long. Well, why would adding a cell phone into it that's sitting in your pocket or sitting on your desk or on your bedstand or something like that? Why would that make a difference? Does that really kind of push cells over the edge? Is there something specific about cell phone radiation? Is it not radiation but heat? Is it is it a particular frequency that the phone uses? I mean, phones have 3-4 different kinds of radios in them. You got, the cellular modem, the Wi-Fi, you've got Bluetooth, you've got NRF, probably, who knows what else. Which one of those frequencies is responsible for that? I don't know. Is it addressed here? No. Should it be? Probably. Science starts with an observation, and then you make an experiment to figure out whether that observation is valid and means what you think it means, and then you go from there. So you don't design the one experiment to rule them all, because you probably can't do that. But you can do something simple, like take a sperm sample, put it in a box with a phone, and see what happens. And then if nothing happens, well, then you go on to something else. If something happens, we go, well, okay, what could that be? And then you go and do the experiment of, with this phone versus that phone, or this frequency versus that frequency. And you kind of narrow it down.
When Lewin pitched this article to me, I was like, oh, dude, that's going to be full of hokey science. And then there are these couple experiments where they actually, again, I don't know why it has to be a cell phone. Why can't it be some other device radiating the right radio frequency ranges and concentrations, or with different concentrations, or there's a whole bunch of different ways to design this experiment. But the one thing I have to say about those is that if the results aren't totally fake, they are definitely doing the right physical experiment. And I think that's super interesting. A lot of the survey studies are kind of weak, and I think I actually went and read a bunch of literature reviews on them, and they all basically say that they're kind of non-conclusive. What is interesting, though, is these were culturing up sperm cells in a petri dish and actually getting decreased motility. And that's a that seems to point at something. But then if what you're looking to explain again is this like 50-year, 70-year long decrease in sperm viability, and you're trying to explain it with cell phones, which have only been around for 20-something years, like it can't be the reason for an event that's gone on for 3 times that long. So I went and, again, dug into it a little bit more, and there's all this WHO reports on it, and they're pointing the finger at things like sedentary lifestyle, increased obesity, smoking, all these things that are kind of the entirely boring health reasons that parts of your body would be unhealthy. And those strike me as being just kind of a priori a hell of a lot more plausible. And that means you really have to rule these out when you're doing studies based on cell phones, because these answers are more a priori plausible. And if you are not explicitly taking these into account in these large regression analyses that these people are doing, there are important missing variables, and you will get biased / wrong results from it. And that's, sorry, fact of life. I taught this sort of stuff in college. Like, I've taught this sort of stuff to undergrads. You shouldn't be falling for this. You wouldn't if you were in my class. I think there may be an effect here. It looks like it's small compared to a lot of other effects, and it looks like it's small compared to a lot of other effects that you personally could do something about, like quit smoking or go jogging. Right. Like, even if you want to keep using your cell phone, wear looser boxer shorts. I mean, there's like a lot of things you can do here. And anywho, I'm not. This is not Hackaday giving you, reproductive advice. God save me. But I do wonder why cell phones, and there is kind of this tendency to always scapegoat the most recent technological thing. And I think this is what's going on with the 5G stuff. And I think this is kind of going on with cell phones here.
On the other hand, you don't just dismiss it out of hand. If you're seeing a signal like that, if you're seeing, hey, we're getting decreased sperm quality in relation to cell phones. Well, it's something that's definitely worth looking into. Maybe don't play it up on the news when the news gets a hold of it and they say, cell phones cause decrease in sperm quality. Well, I don't think that's what anything is saying here. We don't know that. There's still so many I don't knows in this equation that, nobody can make that. That doesn't fit the, 30 seconds on the evening news, really, to have a discussion about that. It's easier to just say the headline is cell phones cause cancer, or, butter causes heart disease, or whatever, you just go with that and move on to the next thing. And that's just a fact of life, an unfortunate fact of life. But when you see signals like this, I say, explore them, but only explore them to the point where you're like, no, ain't nothing there.
That wraps it up for this week's Hackaday podcast. Thanks very much for listening. If you'd like to follow the links, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. And if you see anything cool or do anything cool, send us an email, tips@hackaday.com. And until next week,
keep on hacking.
What is that thing you're clicking?
Oh shit, that you can hear that. Okay, sorry. I found a cable tie to play with. Sorry.
But if you are careful and, excuse me.
Hold on, one more second.
Catacombs. This is episode 246. This is episode 246. Bah. This is, yeah, there we go, finally.
Damn.